Welcome to podcast number 21 in my series, Colonies to Colossus, The Rise of a Giant. In this podcast, we're going to take a look at the Glorious Revolution of 1689. In 1688, King James II fled England. It was the consequence of his political miscalculations. A few months later, in 1689, Parliament installed the new monarchy. It was a peaceful transition of government. All of these events occurred simultaneously with the events I described in my last podcast about the Dominion of New England. But why should Americans care about historical events that occurred in England, especially events that happened so long ago? The answer is this: it is in these events that we can see the origins of American government. The American founding fathers were heavily influenced by the Republican ideals of the English Whig political philosophy that developed in England during this time. Structurally, the United States government and the state governments are in their general outlines mirror images of the English government that emerged from the Glorious Revolution. The English Revolution also produced the English Bill of Rights, which served as a model for the first state constitutions and later as a model for the U.S. Constitution. In fact, I would go as far as to say that it is impossible to understand fully the American government or the U.S. Constitution without reference to the constitutional events of the 1600s in England. The English Revolution was as much a miracle as the American Revolution. It paved the way for the American Revolution. Without the English Revolution, there probably would not have been an American Revolution. England of the 1600s was a place of profound and fundamental social and constitutional changes. In the 1640s, England was the scene of a bitter and bloody civil war between king and parliament. Parliament won that war, and King Charles I was beheaded. Even though Parliament had won this struggle, the relationship between the Crown and Parliament was still largely undefined. On paper, the king still was the sovereign, and everything, including Parliament, functioned under his authority. After more than 10 years of military rule, England decided to restore the monarchy, and in 1660, the son of the king who was beheaded at the end of the Civil War became King Charles II. Charles loved croquet, tennis, horseback riding, and hunting, including hunting in Sherwood Forest. He also liked spending time on his yacht and collecting rare birds. But perhaps the thing Charles loved the most was having lots of women on the side. His bedchamber page had the job of procuring and smuggling women into Charles's private quarters. As a result, there were some unsavory incidents that became public and led to public disgust. After the Civil War, Parliament didn't trust kings with a lot of money, so they kept Charles I on a short leash by never giving him very much money to spend. This kept him reliant on Parliament and gave them some control over him. One member of Parliament explained it this way: if you give the crown too little, you may add it any time. If once you give too much, you will never get it back again. Another member of Parliament put it this way: if you settle such a revenue as that the king should have no need of a parliament, I think we do not our duty to them that sent us hither. To get around these limitations, King Charles connived with the King of France, who was Catholic, and England was Protestant at this time, in a secret treaty called the Treaty of Dover, or at least parts of it were kept secret from the public because they would have been very unpopular. Charles was promised that if he decided to become Catholic, that King Louis of France would support him with troops and money so that England could be reconverted back to Catholicism. This would have given Charles a more absolute power than he had had before, and he wouldn't have had to rely on Parliament for money. In exchange, Charles promised to support Louis in his war against the Netherlands, which probably would have been publicly unpopular. Even though the Dutch were rivals of the English, the Dutch were fellow Protestants, whereas France was Catholic. In 1685, Charles died, and his younger brother took the throne as James II. James was a convert to Catholicism. In a letter to his daughter Anne, he explained his reasons why. He said, "Surely it is only reasonable that this church, which has a constant succession from the time of the apostles to the present, should be more in the right than those private men who under the pretext of reformation have been the authors of new opinions. It was this consideration which principally led me to embrace the communion of the Roman Church, there being no other which claims or can claim infallibility, for there must necessarily be an infallible church, or otherwise what our Savior said cannot be, and the gates of hell would prevail against her." Keep in mind that this was at a time when it was illegal for Catholics to hold office in England, and it was even illegal for them to practice their Catholicism. If James had had as much finesse as his brother Charles has had, he probably would have been able to practice his religion and no one would have mentioned much about it. But James had a high opinion of his kingly power and even wanted to restore Catholicism to England. He wanted to rule as a true medieval-style king with arbitrary powers. He manipulated elections and tried to pack Parliament. He kept an army near London to intimidate the city and Parliament, and believed himself to be above the law. It also didn't help that James brought Catholic Irish troops over from Ireland. The English were terrified that these could be used to force Catholicism back on England. By 1688, only 3 years after coming to power, pressure was mounting to do something about James and his situation. Still, with some finesse, James probably could have survived the situation and remained on the throne as a limited monarch. However, the situation changed in June of 1688 when James had a son. It was presumed that the son would be Catholic, and Protestants who lived in England began to wonder if they would have a Catholic dynasty trying to impose Catholicism on them for another generation at least. Later that month, several prominent English political leaders sent an invitation to William, Prince of Orange, who was a descendant of Charles I and a relative of James. William was also married to James's daughter, Mary. William was commander of Dutch forces, and he brought an army of 21,000 men landing in England on November 5th. James quickly assembled his army and marched to meet William, but his army disintegrated, and he fled back to London. He negotiated some to buy time, but on December 10th, James fled England. Or rather, he was in the act of fleeing England when some fishermen caught him and took him back to London. On December 18th, James fled a second time from England, this time escorted by Dutch soldiers that William had stationed to guard the palace. This time they made sure that James actually got out of England. He arrived in France on Christmas Day. Before James left England, however, he threw the Great Seal of England into the Thames River. This act was his attempt to make sure that Parliament could not be called into session, because only the king could call Parliament into session, and the writs had to have the king's Great Seal on them to be official. After James fled to France, England was without a legal government. England's two political factions, the Whigs and Tories, saw the situation somewhat differently. The Tories, who had always been supportive of the monarchy and who almost saw it with a religious awe, secretly agonized that they had helped to drive out a lawfully enthroned king. On the other hand, the Whigs, who had always been supportive of Parliament, saw the monarchy as a human institution that existed for the benefit of the people. In their minds, James had abused his power, and his Catholicism guaranteed that he would abuse further his power if restored to the throne. Many Whigs saw it not as treason, but as a political public duty to remove a corrupt ruler. This Whig political thinking was deeply influential on America's founding fathers. The month following after James fled to France, elections were held for members to convene as a convention. Really, this just was a parliament, but it didn't have legal sanction because only the king could call a parliament, and he had not summoned one, so they were kind of meeting on their own. In history, this has become known as the Convention Parliament. The Convention Parliament resolved that King James II, having endeavored to subvert the constitution of the kingdom, by breaking the original contract between king and people, and by the advice of Jesuits and other wicked persons, having violated the fundamental laws, and having withdrawn himself out of this kingdom, has abdicated the government, and that the throne is thereby vacant. They went on to resolve that, by the assistance of diverse evil counselors, judges, and ministers employed by him, did endeavor to subvert and extirpate the Protestant religion and the laws and liberties of this kingdom. They also took the unprecedented step of offering the monarchy to William and Mary, who would rule jointly as joint monarchs. In English history, this was totally unprecedented. Hereditary monarchy had always been the order of the day, but now Parliament was firmly in control of English government and has been ever since. I think it's important to pause at this point and to point out how similar these events in England would be to the same events that would happen almost 100 years later in the 1770s in the colonies. In the colonies, when they decided to gain independence from King George, the governor simply fled in most cases, and the legislature just simply took control of the reins of government and began running each colony as a state. This is precisely what had happened in England. King James had fled, and Parliament, being the legislature, simply took over control of government. Importantly, the Convention Parliament also produced a Bill of Rights, known as the English Bill of Rights. This Bill of Rights has served as an important model for the American Constitution, as well as the Bill of Rights that preceded it in the state constitutions. The English Bill of Rights deals with such topics as the power to levy and to spend money according to law and for limited times. It deals with the right to petition the government, prohibitions against standing armies in times of peace, the right to keep and bear arms, freedom of speech and debate for members of Parliament during sessions of Parliament, and prohibitions on cruel and unusual punishments, as well as several other topics, all of which are covered or somehow dealt with in the United States Constitution today. One of the greatest defenders of the Glorious Revolution, or the English Revolution, was John Locke, who lived from 1632 to 1704. Locke asserted that the people were sovereign, and that they're born with certain inalienable rights, and that they only enter into societies to better protect those rights, and that when rulers become oppressive or abusive of those rights, the people have a right to replace these rulers. John Locke exerted a huge and tremendous influence on the colonists and on English political thinking later, and anyone who's familiar with the American Declaration of Independence will automatically quickly see all of these same themes and assertions in there. In closing out this podcast, I don't think it's going too far to say that the English Civil War and the English Revolution of 1689 together form the twin foundation stones upon which American constitutionalism is built. In addition to the books and articles I recommended in my last podcast, and in podcast number 2, I also recommend the following: The English Revolution, 1688 to 1689, by George M. Trevelyan. A Monarchy Transformed, Britain, 1603 to 1714, by Mark Kishlansky. Royal Survivor, A Life of Charles II, by Stephen Coote. A Constitutional and Legal History of England, by Goldwin Smith. And Elizabethan Parliaments, 1559 to 1601, by Michael A. R. Graves.